Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for making time today to join us for this session of the Friday Fast for Justice series, hosted by the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Our office is physically situated in the original homelands of the Piscataway people, but we are so grateful to be joining you all online today. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves with your name and where you are zooming in from in the chat. I am Lily Kennedy, and I'm so glad to be with you all. This series honors the sacred season of Lent for Christians, and today is the end of the fourth week of Lent, which is hard to believe that we're already this far in. Today is also Eid, the end of Ramadan, so I wanted to take a moment to wish our Muslim friends and colleagues Eid Mubarak and happy Eid. And Kathleen just told us it's also the first day of spring, so happy spring. At CFJ, we recognize the need to integrate spiritual grounding with practical action. So we began this series with 2 sessions focused on practices to nurture spiritual resilience through contemplation and imagination. I hope you're all continuing to engage those practices as we journey deeper into the Lenten season. Starting at our last session 2 weeks ago and moving forward, we are now shifting our gears into practical nonviolent resistance training. Today's session, Making Authoritarian Repression Backfire, comes at a critical moment. At a time of rising authoritarianism, communities and organizations must come together to resist threats, intimidation, and abuses of power. One of the most potent ways we can do this is to plan ahead so that anticipated attacks backfire against perpetrators. Drawing insights from research and practitioners around the world, today's session will outline a 5-step backfire planning framework that can be applied by groups at a range of scales, from the local to the national level. And we are so honored today to be joined again by Hardy Merriman for the second of a 3-part series on nonviolent resistance. For more than 20 years, Hardy's work has focused on pro-democracy movements, confronting authoritarian governments and democratic backsliding worldwide. He is the former president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, led the Fostering Fourth Democratic Wave project as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and served as a senior technical advisor to USAID's Powered by the People program. He's also the author of numerous publications, including Harnessing Our Power to End Political Violence, Fostering a Democratic Fourth Wave, a playbook for countering the authoritarian threat, and Hold the Line, a guide to defending democracy. Hardy, we are so grateful for your leadership and for sharing your expertise with us again today, and we look forward to hearing from you. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. And again, thank you to the Georgetown Center on Faith and Justice for inviting me here. Thank you to Jim Simpson. Thank you to Kathleen Burnett and the staff who have made this possible. And to everyone who has joined today and giving 90 minutes of your Friday, I also really want to appreciate you for sharing this space and taking the time. So today I want to talk about, as the title is, authoritarian repression and how we make it backfire. And I'm going to draw on my background focused on really supporting movements around the world that are confronting authoritarian government, something I've done for almost 25 years. In my career, I've worked with movements for women's rights, economic justice and labor rights, the rights of historically marginalized communities, movements for peace and security, movements for environmental justice, movements against corruption, and more broadly, just movements trying to advance democracy against authoritarian governments. And then increasingly over the last decade, looking also at movements that are trying to push back when democracy is failing. When democracies are what we call backsliding, when they're eroding and becoming less and less free and fair. How is it that people push back? And a central element of pushing back when your democracy is failing or when you're in a fully authoritarian government is the ability to make their repression backfire. So it's a very timely topic as well. So let me share my slides and dive in. Great. Can I get a thumbs up if folks can see it? Great. I see multiple thumbs. Fantastic. So what I want to do today is I always like to start simply by defining my terms. I never want to assume that when I say the word authoritarianism, for example, or authoritarian repression, that we're all talking about the same thing, that we're all thinking about it in the same way. So I'll define what I mean when I say the word authoritarian or authoritarianism, and then I will talk a little bit about what kinds of repression authoritarians use. Um, it's not just physical. Sometimes there are a variety of ways that authoritarians try to consolidate power over their societies. And then what I want to do is talk a little bit about repression from the way that an authoritarian would think about it. How do autocrats think about repression? What's going through their mind when they're trying to make decisions about what repression to use, or how much, or who or when? They have their own decision making process. And to be sure, every situation is different, but it's an interesting exercise to think about things from their perspective and to try to draw from some research about what we know about how they think about repression and the effects that it has. And then I want to talk a little bit about so basically sort of 3, 4, and 5 are all sort of about repression as an autocrat. And then the last part, but I will spend a good chunk of time on it, is thinking about repression now from the movement perspective, from the human rights or pro-democracy movement perspective. How do we make it backfire? So we're going to define our terms. We're going to look at it from one aspect, from the sort of government autocrat perspective, and then we're going to look at it from the movement perspective and think, what are the things that movements can do so that when repression happens to them, that they can actually make it backfire. The movements can emerge even stronger than before. They can use repression actually as an organizing opportunity, and make sure that they can try to ultimately shift the cost-benefit analysis in the autocrat's head about why they're using repression. And if anything I said there is not totally clear, it will become clear in the course of this presentation. So to start, let's just define terms. The word authoritarian is used in all kinds of ways. It's used in political rhetoric. The United States sometimes labels other governments as authoritarian, but other governments will label the United States as authoritarian. In political discourse, all sides claim to stand for democracy, and many sides claim that the other side is authoritarian. And so I like, for me, as somebody who does human rights work and democracy work, internationally and in the U.S., I don't think about these just as like rhetorical terms. I try to think of them as analytical terms. Like precisely what do they mean? And there's no perfect definition of either. But the way I think about them, or one way I think about them, is to think of them as opposing ideals. There's the democratic ideal and the authoritarian, or some would say autocratic ideal. And they're opposites. And what they relate to is how society is going to manage conflict and make decisions. And in the democratic ideal, there are a few key elements to this. Democracies, at least as an ideal, are trying to get violence out of decision-making processes. They don't always live up to that. I'm not talking about US democracy as it's been practiced. I'm talking about the ideal of democracy. And the way that democracies try to manage the polarization in their society and all the differences is to say, we're going to have institutional processes that are fair, that you can trust. And if you get to make your best argument, if you win, you get to hold on to power, but you'll be held accountable. And if you lose, you will have your rights will be protected and you'll get another chance. Those are at a fundamental level sort of the rules of the democratic game. So to do this, democracies have a few sort of core pillars to them. One is regular, free, and fair elections. A free and fair election is an election where all the votes are counted and where the results are accepted. Widespread popular participation in those elections as well is critical. The suffrage, the vote, has to be shared widely among the population, and many different kinds of people have to be able to enter the political system as candidates. A third is that democracies have civil and political rights, particularly rights to free expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, the rights that we have in our First Amendment of our Constitution, for example. A fourth is that democracies tend to have rule of law. This means there's an independent branch called the judiciary that's actually independent of the executive or the legislature, trying to figure out how the law will apply and deciding that fairly and independently. And then the last is that they have a free and independent media. Now, you could come up with many other criteria for something to be called a democracy. I'm not trying to come up with the total inclusive list here. For example, you could also add civilian control of the military as a critical aspect of a democracy. You could add a vibrant civil society as a critical aspect of democracy, or a separation of religion and state as an aspect of democracy. But I outline these five just as sort of core elements of saying here are some institutions and ideas for how society is going to manage conflict in a way that gets violence out of the decision-making process, that has what are supposed to be fair and independent processes, so that no win is predetermined and no loss is ever permanent. You can always try again, you can always come back, and the winner always has to continue to perform and make the case to the public that they should be able to stay there and play by the rules. So if that's democracy in its ideal form, authoritarianism is the opposite. Authoritarians are not interested in free and fair elections. They're interested in undermining free and fair elections. Authoritarians are not interested in having all eligible voters being able to vote. They're interested in choosing their voters to vote and then putting impediments to others who they think will oppose them. Authoritarians definitely don't like rights. They are entirely selective about who they determine, whose rights are recognized and who are not. They heavily try to tilt the rule of law through threats to judges or corruption or any other possible way they can try to co-opt or coerce the judiciary to no longer be independent. And of course, they don't like free and accurate reporting of information. They only like information that reflects well on them, so they tend to clamp down on the media. So when we think about these things as opposing ideals, again, thinking of them as a continuum, wherever you think your society is starting on this line, authoritarians want to move it towards the authoritarian column. And people who are pro-democracy want to move it closer to the democratic side. So that is how I'm thinking about it. So you can have authoritarians and authoritarian style leaders in a country that is still democratic, and you can have a point of transition where your democracy becomes net authoritarian, even if it still has elections. There's subtlety and complications there. There's nuance, but I think of them as a scale. And so a central thing about authoritarians is because they don't want to have to argue for their ideas fairly with accountability and have those ideas decided by voters who can vote and have all the votes counted and have the rule of law and the rules of the game, they try to find all kinds of ways to go outside of these rules. And generally this happens through threats or through corruption or through things that are illegal or at least certainly against the norms. And they're trying to constantly short circuit democracy, sort of go around it to be able to get their needs met. And they're highly motivated to stay in power because authoritarians tend, the more they are successful in circumventing the mechanisms of democracy to get their way, the more afraid they are of losing power. And this is part of why they use repression. So what kind of repression do they use? I'll list a few kinds. The first and most common is reputational. They attack people, or generally try to have their proxies attack people in the press or in the media, including social media. They will do reputational attacks. And one of the reasons why is because reputational attacks are very cheap. They're easy. Authoritarians usually have an infrastructure set up for mass communications, and they can just channel attacks through it. It doesn't cost them very much, and generally attacks on a person are fairly low risk, or a group, for them. They don't have a high risk of backfire. Occasionally they do, but generally reputational repression is seen as like the first thing they do, and generally fairly low risk. And it also tends to precede other forms of repression that they do. So a second kind of repression they do is administrative repression, or using the legal system. This is actually a very, very common and powerful form of authoritarian repression. When we think of authoritarians, we tend to think of physical violence, riot police or, the state putting people in jail. And yes, authoritarians do that. But a lot of how they consolidate power is actually through the administrative capacity of the state. Funding cuts, threats of legal action, threats to deny a corporation a merger, all kinds of retaliatory things that they can do to try to get big institutions to fall in line with their agenda. It's a huge part of what authoritarians do. Administrative repression is powerful. It both is powerful, it can profoundly affect like a university or law firm when targeted there, and then it can scare the rest of them. It has a deterrent effect on the rest of them because they're like, my gosh, they've just lost hundreds of millions of dollars for something that seemed totally arbitrary, but the autocrat seems to be getting away with it. So other institutions tend to back away, which is often a very self-defeating thing, by the way, because the more institutions back away when repression happens, the more the authoritarian tends to feel emboldened, which is why we have to make them backfire, which is a big part of what I'm going to talk about. But administrative repression, it's hard to make it backfire sometimes. You don't always have a clear visual of the damage it causes. It can seem abstract to people. The funding numbers seem just like numbers on a spreadsheet. It's hard to make like the real human impact felt and understood by the public on those, which is why they're less likely to backfire. And then they have physical repression, actual arrests, actual beatings, the things, shootings, the things that we associate most with dictatorship and which dictators do and autocrats do, but they actually are, physical repression tends to be the highest risk form of repression for them. And often a high cost form of repression for them too, if they have to do it at a large scale. So they do it, but primarily, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, they do it to try to scare others because they don't have the capacity to do lots of physical repression all the time. Most autocrats don't. Most authoritarians don't. And so what are their goals? We just talked about a few of them. One is to try to directly affect a particular individual or group or particular target that they don't like. But usually the biggest goal is others. Usually the biggest goal is if they go after one group, one institution, one university, one law firm, one labor union, one faith community, one activist, whoever it is, one, media outlet, the real goal of them usually is to scare all the others. The actual target of repression is us for most of the repression that they do. Yes, the direct target is whoever they're going after, but their real intended target, whose behavior they want to influence, is everyone else, primarily, in general. And so that is a huge factor for them. So when we think about their cost-benefit analysis, the authoritarian, am going to attack X group with the goal of scaring all the other groups that think I could come for them next. That's their intended calculation. Backfire is about shifting that calculation by saying, when you actually go after that particular group, we're not going to back away. We're actually going to come to their aid and be even stronger and more organized. When you attack us, we're actually going to use it as a chance to become stronger. There are a few other reasons why authoritarians use repression, though. One is they'll sometimes use repression to consolidate control over various institutions. So authoritarians are they're very paranoid, and they're concerned about loyalty. They tend to prize loyalty over competence. In fact, they tend not to like people who are highly competent at their jobs, because someone who's highly competent at their jobs might actually stand up to the authoritarian and say, don't do that. So they actually try to find ways to get competent people out of jobs. And one of the ways they do that is they'll take a government department or agency and they'll ask them to do something that is really unpopular. The people who have strong sense of, taking their oath seriously are going to say, we don't want to do that. And the authoritarians will order groups to do that precisely because they want to see who stands up. And then when they see who stands up, they try to fire them. It's another purpose of what they do. It sounds wild. Why would you be ordering really unpopular things? That's actually one reason why. Let's identify who in the institution might not carry out my orders, and then I can try to fire them. Sometimes authoritarians use repression as well to appease their base. Sometimes their base demands repression. If the United States was, had an attack that happened on our soil, there would be a demand for to go and find a group to repress who did that. So that's like a classic example of like there, even if it was hard for the government to figure out how to do that, the government would feel a like a pressure to attack something because the United States has been attacked. And then a last reason that I'll mention is that authoritarians use repression to try to provoke counterviolence. Authoritarian repression, we know, when they use disproportionate high levels of repression, they're trying to induce a traumatic response in others, a sense of despair and hopelessness, and a sort of triggering fight or flight. And that they're hoping that by being outrageously repressive, that people will conclude that they need to fight back through violence. That is a very intended, deliberate psychological effect that they try to produce with their repression. And I will say, if we want repression to backfire, it's really critical we not fall into that trap. That is a dead end. That is their game. And there are ways that they of behaving that they do not know how to deal with well, and that is to remain nonviolent, but to remain courageous, to be strategic, and to push back with large numbers of people. They don't know how to deal with that. And so one of the ways they try to short circuit it is see if we can try to provoke folks to violence, and then we can try to crack down. So the authoritarian logic of repression, I'll just bake it down really simple. When they're thinking about how much repression to use, when to use it, and which form of repression to use, I can't get in the head of every authoritarian. I wouldn't want to. But just generally, the way they might think about it is to try to minimize the cost to the authoritarian. Physical repression is costly, especially when there's a lot of it, so they'll try to use the minimum amount possible to achieve their desired effect. Generally, we can always find exceptions. And they're going to try to use forms of repression that create minimal risk for them. They are very concerned about backfire. They're very concerned about creating widespread outrage and mobilization. So they're going to try to find like what's the kind of relatively small amount that I can do. It's going to minimize my risk, but that will maximize the fear and obedience in a population. And the logic of a nonviolent resistance movement is the opposite. If the autocrat's going to use repression, or the authoritarian, they're going to have to use a lot of it, and it's going to be very expensive for them, and it's not going to work very well. In fact, the authoritarian is going to drain their budget to try to use repression because the movement's very difficult to repress. And when they do try to repress the movement, that it actually creates a backfire effect, maximizes their risk. And as we think about like a scenario where you like to sort of take this out of the abstract, imagine right now if there was a protest against the Iran war on Lafayette Park just north of the White House. And let's say there's 500 people. How would, and of course the administration wouldn't like that. So how would they think about that? Well, you'd have different views within the administration. Some might want to do something that's more heavy-handed. Some might want to just do something that focuses on reputation. Some might want to ignore it. And their response would also depend on who the protesters are. Maybe it's all military veterans doing the protest. Or maybe it's a partisan group doing the protest. Or maybe it's the group where they're like, you know what, they'll probably just come here, get tired, go home, and that'll be it. Or another group might say, you know what, we're coming and we're going to try to stay there for a week, or we're going to be back every week and our numbers are going to grow. All of these different factors would affect how they think about what they are going to do. Does that make sense? It's so they actually, what I'm trying to show you, it would be similar. Like I'll pick another issue. If there was a protest around the Epstein files, they would like that would have a whole different set of thoughts for them about like, okay, well, if we attack it, do we draw more attention to it? Does that they're constantly thinking through sort of how do we make this go away in a way that mitigates our risk? And there are a lot of different factors in how they do it, and they don't always know before they act what the effect is going to be. And so they don't know if they make a concession, if it's going to help them and make things go away, or if it's actually going to cause people to gain confidence and continue to mobilize. Sometimes authoritarians will give half a concession to see if half the group will go home. Sometimes they'll try to divide, but they don't know. But there is always that option. They can ignore or they could give a concession. Or if they choose repression, they don't know if low levels of repression, like a few arrests, are going to make the problem go away or are going to lead to actually backfire and lead to high levels of mobilization. Or maybe some would argue they should use mid levels of repression, like riot police. Or maybe some would argue they should use high levels of repression, potentially even lethal repression. These are what authoritarians think through in terms of options. And my point to you is that they don't know the impact of what they're choosing before they choose it. There's no perfect formula for them. In fact, it's very unpredictable for them when they use it. And I'll talk about why in a second, but let me just share a couple sort of results of studies on this. So there are a number of academic studies that find that at low levels of repression, you tend to get high levels of mobilization. And then as repression increases, mobilization goes down. People become more and more afraid. So that's one relationship. But it's not the only one. Other studies find the opposite. As repression increases, mobilization increases because more and more people get outraged and actually want to come out to the streets and make it backfire. The authoritarian doesn't know which one of these is going to happen. And then there's other studies that actually find the inverted U shape, where low levels of repression, like arrests, don't tend to create a lot of outrage. But when repression escalates to the mid-level, like riot police, lots of people get outraged and mobilized. But if it becomes really severe, the repression becomes really severe, people go home. But then there's even a study that finds the opposite. Low levels of repression create outrage but low fear, so people come out. Mid levels of repression create a significant fear that people stay home. High levels of repression create such outrage that people then come out again. And so why would you have all these different outcomes of repression? Part of why is because the impact of repression does not just depend on what the authoritarian does. It depends on the movement. It depends on the organizers. It depends on the activists. They have a significant impact on what the outcome is as well. Which is, again, why it's so important to think about how to make repression backfire. Movement has a very significant role in determining the impact that repression has. The authoritarian doesn't hold all the cards. And so authoritarians, they have some limits too on their repressive capacity. Sometimes people think they just push a button and it's like, oh, push the repression button and things happen. Well, we can already see that actually they have to do a lot of thinking about this. And they generally will have advisors talk about options, and even the advisors won't all agree on what the right path forward is. And they're a little bit flying blind because they're not even sure what the impact's going to be. And then there are also some limits that they have. And so sometimes if they engage in repression, they will have sort of huge legitimacy costs, domestically or internationally, that can limit them. I'll give you an example of that. Sometimes they're uncertain that if they actually order repression, will the security services even carry it out? Sometimes they order repression and it actually causes splits in other parts of their government. And again, I'll give examples of this. And sometimes they just do not have the capacity to do repression at the scale that they might want to. And so I'll start with legitimacy costs. Authoritarians, they do care to some extent about public opinion. Public opinion doesn't ultimately constrain them, but they would like to at least not do things that just make it plummet through the floor. And so here's an example in Egypt. This is in 2011. This is during the uprising against Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. They were demanding democracy against his dictatorship. And one thing Mubarak did as an act of repression is he shut off the internet for 4 or 5 days. at the end of January, early February, and it, he had to turn it back on after 4 or 5 days for a few reasons. Number one, people don't like it when you shut off the internet, so people were furious at him. It actually started to backfire. Another reason is that his business sector couldn't function without the internet, so they were putting pressure on him. So he's like, okay, I will turn the internet back on. And the night of, I think it was February 2nd, he gave a conciliatory speech saying he'd heard the protesters' demands and that he, was calling for calm. And that very same night that he gave that speech, he actually lined up hundreds of armed men, some of them on the backs of camels, with hand weapons and had them charge into the crowd at like 2 or 3 in the morning, and people died. Um, and this act of repression was so outrageous, particularly after he'd just given this speech calling for calm, that people like it actually backfired enormously. Um, and within days, it was done, and he never tried it again. Both the international condemnation was too high for him and the domestic condemnation was too high for him. And so he never tried that kind of repression again because of just the sheer level of outrage that it caused, both internationally and domestically. Anderson Cooper, I remember, was reporting and just like that put it out to international audiences. And ultimately that constrained Mubarak to some extent of engaging in that kind of repression. Another aspect, though, that authoritarians are concerned about, which relates to the first, is actually if I order unpopular repression, will my security services even do it? And so another element of what happened in Egypt is that the military, became pretty clear, probably wouldn't carry out highly repressive orders if Mubarak gave them, that they were probably going to stand aside. And so he actually realized I can't depend on them. Now, this is not to say that the Egyptian military was pro-democracy. They have proven very much to not be pro-democracy after Mubarak fell. It is only to say that Mubarak's sort of ability to think through what are my options here was very constrained because one of his core pillars of support would probably not go along with what he asked them to do. And that is actually a more common circumstance with dictators and autocrats and authoritarians than we think. They're not sure if they give orders, will those orders be followed by certain institutions? In Ukraine in 2004, there was something called the Orange Revolution, where there was an attempt to steal an election, and protesters occupied Maidan Square in Kyiv and demanded, that a new election be held. And actually, the Supreme Court and the Electoral Tribunal ruled that that can happen, and then the new election was held, and it was under fairer rules, and the opposition was ruled the winner, which was amazing. And there was interviews afterwards with members of the Ministry of the Interior saying, what were you thinking at that time that this happened? And there's this quote that our calculation was if the Interior Ministry beats protesters, then the military will come and turn on us. So sometimes, even among the security services of an autocrat, there will be potential conflicts. So part of what constrained the Interior Ministry from repressing protesters was fear that if we do this, the army may turn on us. And I say these things to you, I share them here because they're things that most people don't know. Cracks in an authoritarian coalition tend to remain hidden, but they're always there. And authoritarians are quite aware of them and sometimes are constrained by them. There are other cracks too. Repression sometimes causes the business community to start to put pressure on autocrats. So I'll give you an example. In South Africa, in the 1980s, the leading force pushing back on apartheid was the United Democratic Front, which was a large sort of number of locally rooted civic organizations, trade unions, and others in cities and towns across the country. And when the United Democratic Front started calling for boycotts of white-owned businesses, the government in South Africa, the apartheid government, I'll give you one example, in Port Elizabeth, for example, in 1984, when there was a big boycott call against white businesses, the government of South Africa really freaked out. And they declared a state of emergency because there was a boycott in one city against white businesses. So they declared the state of emergency, and you know what it accomplished for them? Absolutely nothing. It didn't stop the boycott. So then the government goes and tries to arrest the leaders of the boycott, and they do. And you know what? It accomplished absolutely nothing. The boycott just continued. And so when the government was using this repression, it wasn't actually speaking to the demands of the movement. What happened is that the Chamber of Commerce of Port Elizabeth, which is predominantly white, said, you know what? Can we just talk to the protesters, try to figure this out? And so they actually started to shift. The repression is part of what drove them being like, look, what you're doing is not working. And it's actually not working for us because the longer no one buys from our businesses, the more our businesses are hurt. Let's try to shift tactics here and see what we can do. And they came up with a negotiation with members of the UDF in Port Elizabeth to try to de-escalate the boycott. In fact, one UDF member who was a leader had to be let out of jail simply to negotiate with the white Chamber of Commerce. And these kind of splits between sort of the political community and government and business are common when the government starts using repression. Another example you can see is in the sit-ins in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement, whether it's in Greensboro, North Carolina, Nashville, Tennessee. What happened with these sit-ins to protest and resist Jim Crow is that ultimately they led to boycotts of downtown businesses. And again, you had downtown businesses say, look, repression is actually not solving our problem. And they start to split off and put pressure on the government to say, solve it through another way, give some concessions. And then a last sort of point I'll make in terms of like the limited repressive capacity of the state is that there are certain actions that they just can't repress because they don't have capacity. So a classic example would be action against Augusto Pinochet, one of the most brutal autocrats of the 20th century. In 1983, when copper miners, decided they were going to go on strike, there was an open pit copper mine. Pinochet surrounded the mine with his military and threatened them to strike. And so what the miners did is they said, we're not going to strike, but we're going to call for a slowdown for everyone who basically agrees with us and wants change. And so when the day of the slowdown, people were supposed to walk slow and drive slow. And as this is a society at this time that is ruled by a totalitarian sort of autocrat who is terrorized his population, and where people are too afraid to ever talk politics, because if I have to talk politics with you, how do I know that you're not an informant? So the trust is very low. But on the day of the slowdown, people are looking around and they start to see everyone seems like they're walking and driving slowly. And how does Pinochet possibly repress that? Number one, he doesn't have the capacity to monitor everyone everywhere all the time. Number two, how can you determine the rate at which someone normally walks? Number three, what do you arrest someone just for walking a little slowly? You can't do it. And so they get away with it. They can do it. And what it communicates to everyone is that although we're too afraid to talk, we can all see each other now. We see that actually the number of people who oppose this man is huge in this regime. And at night, people start banging pots and pans in what's called the cacerolazo, which is another thing that was done in dark, that was unrepressible because it could just be done for a few seconds. It could be done anywhere. You couldn't see who was doing it. And this is, again, action that there is no capacity to repress. The Port Elizabeth boycotts were similar. State of emergency, arrested boycott leaders. At the end of the day, they could not force Black South Africans and their allies to buy. They simply couldn't. No repression was going to be adequate to do that. And here's some actually, I love these posters from the United Democratic Front. I'll just put these on here. They capture some of the spirit of people boycotting. And then I'll give you another example of sort of the way that tactics can be used to make repression very, very costly. In the 1970s, in the province of Queensland, Australia, the Premier of Queensland outlawed marches. Not that that was constitutional or legal to do, but he simply said there will be no more marches here. This was at that time where there was a lot of anti-nuclear organizing in Australia. And so he tries to outlaw marches, and here's some responses that he got. I'll give you three. The first is that people in New South Wales, the province directly south from Queensland, would say they're going to start a march in New South Wales and march into Queensland. And so they would start their march in New South Wales, and the police would be waiting for them at the border of Queensland, and then they would march right up to the border and then stop marching and just sit there and march in place while looking at the police with signs saying Queensland is a police state. The state has to spend money and gets virtually no benefit from it. And it's demoralizing to the security forces who are told to do this. Then students created a new innovation called the No March, where they would declare that they were going to start a march at like a quad at the university the next morning, maybe 9 in the morning, and that they would all gather there, and the police were waiting to arrest them, and then the students would gather, and before they left the quad and the university gates, they'd say, you know what, we're not going to march, but we'll come back in 2 hours and march. So the police just had to stay there and get paid. And I don't know if any of you have been to Queensland, it can be very hot and muggy. And just stand there and wait. And then they can come back again in 2 hours. You know what? We'll be back in 2 hours. Don't leave. You can arrest us in 2 hours. And then another person said, I'm going to actually do a march at 2 a.m. in a sugarcane field. And he announced it. It was a one-person march. He marched with his dog, with a sign that said something like "Dogs can march too." And the regime, this is kind of sort of classic authoritarians, are like, because they're so insecure, they actually arrested the guy, which people thought was ridiculous and outrageous. And the guy ended up actually being booked on like TV shows talking about it. And so there are ways to think creatively when authoritarians do really arbitrary stuff to make it very expensive for them in terms of resources, but also just in terms of the morale of the people who are being tasked to do things that they probably didn't sign up to do, that probably don't make them feel too good at the end of the day. Now, don't get me wrong, authoritarians do have some people who are very zealous in what they do and wanting to, and wanting to carry out authoritarian orders. But there are others who are generally feeling like this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I want to do. And they start internally channeling that dissent, saying, make this stop. This is not working. Okay. So my basic point, if I'm going to drill it down into one sentence, is this. The autocrats or the authoritarians' capacity and their cost-benefit calculation for repression can change over time based on the actions of a popular nonviolent movement. It's not automatic. So maybe before I go on and talk about Backfire, I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions or comments based on anything discussed so far. Anyone have any?
I love the posters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those posters could apply to our situation now in this country. And it also encourages more to join, like in the boycott, so that those who can't march can quietly be a part of it all. I do have a question that if I know boycotts have been called against some national entities, but how will they know there's a boycott if we don't tell them we're boycotting them?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing, yep.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
So something about boycotts that I have noticed is that sometimes they start actually through a backfire action, which is actually a perfect segue. So when we think about the Montgomery bus boycott, if you just called for a boycott of Montgomery buses, it may not have gone through. It was known that women in Montgomery wanted to boycott those buses. It was known that the bus system in Montgomery was a good target because more than 70% of its revenues came from African American riders. But what was actually going to create the trigger for that to really happen? And it wasn't a call by itself. It was a backfire action. It was, let's create an action where they're going to do repression. We have Rosa Parks prepared. and we're going to make this backfire on them. And that will be the call for the boycott. And so I think, that is one way actually that some boycotts start. Others start differently. Others can be a slow build. Others involve a lot of community engagement and education first to sort of get them there. But there are a number of cases where it has been actually repression backfiring that has led to a boycott. Maybe one or two others before I go on. I know I'm throwing a lot at you all.
There have been a few questions in the chat, so I do want to highlight a couple of those. Do any governments self-identify as authoritarian, and what are their motivations? And then another one that I think is interesting, I think this is in the context of No Kings coming up, but advice on whether someone should participate in their small town protests or travel into a larger city.
Mm. So the first question, do any governments self-identify as authoritarian? Was that the first question?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. Probably a few do. They've tried to make it seem cool. I mean, definitely a few do. Um, Most won't directly say, "Hey, I violate human rights on a massive scale." They'll always claim that they're, there to protect the people. But some of them definitely try to develop this strong man image, since it generally is a man, and try to embrace authoritarianism, which they always claim again is for the protection of their population. So they sort of try to dress authoritarianism up as this like necessary thing to keep the freedom of their population and protect the rights of their population. So there is some of that happens. Um, and actually, one of the things that's happened over the last 25 years is that authoritarianism has become more normalized, and authoritarians have worked really hard to try to get people to feel that it's normal. And 25 years ago, democracy was largely ascendant in the world, and that has shifted significantly. I don't think that is the end of the story. I think we can shift it back. Um, Historically, democracy and authoritarianism have risen and eroded in waves, but it won't shift back automatically. It is something that we have to make shift back. Yeah. And then on the question about participation, um, I think there are different views on, where it might be best to participate if you plan to protest, and a lot will depend on the circumstance. I will say, from my perspective, that one of the things that's been really amazing to me over the last year is the sheer number of locations that people are participating in actions. To give a comparison, the Women's March of 2017, which was a really amazing action, is estimated to have taken place in around 650 locations around the country. The No Kings 2 protest of last October uh, was estimated to take place in between 2,500 to 2,700 locations around the country. And I think that in the information environment that we have, where a lot of people are, given an algorithm that gives them perhaps not a complete or distorted view of what's going on, it's very important and powerful to people to see with their own eyes people in their own community standing up. I think that if your news feed is giving you a certain kind of news about what the people over there are doing in a big city or elsewhere, you might be more liable to just believe what you're being told about it. But if you see it in your own community too, and you actually see people you respect, whether they're teachers, doctors, community leaders, faith leaders, whoever, actually out there, it has a very different effect on cutting through some of the misinformation that people may hear. So I guess I would in general fall on the side of bloom where you're planted. Do what you're doing where you are. Because the more places people can see that people want to stand up for democracy, in my view, the better it is. And the better it is at cutting through a very, very sort of toxic level of polarization that is right now being fed by social media and our media environment. Okay, let's move on to Backfire. So what I'm going to present to you comes out of work. Actually, I'll start there. Comes out of work. It's based on work done by Brian Martin, who's a scholar at University of Wollongong in Australia, and some of his colleagues. Martin studied Backfire. Why is it that authoritarians so often get away with abuse? But why is it that sometimes they don't? What are the factors when they're not able to get away with it? What are the things that people can do? And so Martin studied repression and abuse and backfire all over the world. Different cases from different countries, different contexts. What happens if a mayor does something? What happens if a president does something? What happens if a CEO does something? To try to figure out, why does this stuff backfire sometimes but not others? And so I really am indebted to him. A couple years ago, I wrote a guide with the support of the Horizons Project and the 22nd Century Initiative called Harnessing Our Power to End Political Violence that builds on this backfire framework. What I was observing was that the threats of political violence in the United States were rising, so had risen significantly, and that they were having a very, very corrosive effect on our democracy. And also that because we have strong free speech rights in this country, many threats of political violence that were changing the behavior of elected officials or business leaders or organization leaders or whoever, many of those would not, there was no actually legal response to them, either because they went unreported or because the threats were terrible, but they didn't rise to the level of something that could be prosecuted. So I wanted to write a guide that said, look, we can actually change the cost benefit calculation of the people making threats and inciting threats, but not necessarily just through legal means, since those are very limited, or legal channels, but rather through using community mobilization mechanisms, by trying to make threats and political violence backfire by actually having it lead to community mobilization. And so that's this guide, which is available in English and Spanish online, and I draw on Martin's framework in it. So yes, and it's written, this guide in particular, if you take a look, is written for folks who are concerned about attacks primarily from what we call non-state actors, from violent groups that are doing this. In other words, most of this guide isn't written from the perspective of the federal government doing violence to you. That's obviously changed in the last year. But what I would say is that many of the lessons in the guide are still very, very relevant. And by the way, I'm not saying the federal government didn't ever do violence prior to last year. I'm just saying the context of our government changed significantly. Okay, so what is backfire? Backfire can take place in one of two ways. It's basically when a perpetrator's actions have the exact opposite effect of what they intend. So one way this can manifest is that the target of injustice or abuse becomes stronger. They gain more visibility, legitimacy, and recognition. They gain more allies, and people mobilize on their behalf. And or the perpetrator of injustice actually becomes weaker as an effect of their abuse. They lose public support or money. Their coalition starts to fracture. People who they depend on start to move away or defect from them. Those are the two ways backfire can happen. Sometimes you get part one, which then leads to part two. But autocrats really know what they're doing. Authoritarians are concerned about backfire. And so they put a lot of energy into making sure that their abuse doesn't. And this is the 5 steps that Martin identified that they use to try to reduce the chance that backfire happens. So the first thing they'll do is they'll try to cover up an injustice, claim it never happened, or prevent word about it from spreading. Second thing they do is they try to devalue the target. Whoever has been abused or hurt, they try to question their legitimacy, their social standing, or make them seem unworthy. The third thing they do is try to reinterpret what happened. They'll try to minimize and claim, well, no real damage was done. They'll try to justify what was done. For example, if police do abuse that is outrageous, they might still claim, well, it was justified for public order. And they will also sometimes try to deflect blame to others. So we see this, for example, in people who incite threats of political violence. They do a lot of inciting. They know exactly what they're doing. But if someone actually carries out political violence, they'll distance themselves and say, well, I didn't call for that. You can't blame me. We also see this in other cases too. For example, when the United States when you had some members of the US military in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq who engaged in torture. Those who did the torture claimed that there was a permissive environment by their higher ups to allow this to happen, and their higher ups maybe knew that it would have happened. And their higher ups said, no, 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 this is just a case of some things that got out of control we didn't know. So that's a classic distancing. And then they also downplayed, I mean, the US also downplayed when it was doing torture. It said it's not torture, it's stress positions, it's enhanced interrogation, try to minimize the damage done, do things that don't leave a physical scar. And then when those three opening tactics fail, the fourth thing is that there will usually be some kind of institutional process, either a lawsuit, judicial proceeding, or some kind of investigation. And when that happens, what the authoritarians try to do is they will try to control the timeline, make it not public, and control the rules around that so that they can stretch out how long it takes. They can control who gets to testify. They can control what the public sees. And they can hope that by stretching things out, that they're just going to hope that things die down. We're seeing right now in our country various things where there's outrage, but they're just trying to stretch it out as far as they can, hoping that the outrage dies down. It's a classic tactic. And it's challenging because, of course, if a process is going to figure out what's happened and find justice, it does need to have clear rules of evidence and otherwise. So it's not to say that clear rules of evidence or specific procedures are bad, but they are technical and they tend to limit public involvement, and they do tend to take time, and the public does tend to move on. And so, and this is all intentional on the part of those who are being authoritarian. They want this to happen. And then the last thing is, of course, they try to intimidate those who might speak out, and they try to bribe or reward those who stay silent or take their side. And so this is the classic 5 steps. Again, it's been done in countries around the world at all scales: local, national, public sector, private sector. It's a human thing. This is not a culturally specific phenomenon, how these play out. And so the question is, how do we then do backfire? Well, first we've got to recognize again that all these take effort, that authoritarians are trying to put effort. They're really trying. They have a very effective system of doing these 5 things. So when we look and we say, why isn't it obvious to people that abuse has been done? It's because there's a lot of effort being put into making sure people don't come to that conclusion, or that people don't feel confident in that conclusion and therefore don't take action. It's not enough for us to assume that something that seems obvious to us, something is an injustice, something is an abuse, is that going to be obvious to others? Not when there's a lot of effects to make sure it's not obvious to others. Okay, so what do? We've got what we call the 5 R's. The first is reveal. You have to reveal that the injustice or abuse is happening. And sometimes the authoritarians do that for you. They actually want to reveal something terrible that they're doing because they're going to hope it spreads fear. But there's still a step in terms of how we talk about it, and I'll talk about what it means to reveal once everyone already knows that this thing has happened. There's still an element of strategy in terms of how we talk about and reveal what happened, even if it's already known. The second is you have to validate the target. The efforts to otherize or distance them from the rest of the population have to be turned on their head. They need to be validated. They need to be seen as human. They need to be seen as, we need to bridge between whoever's been targeted, and if they're targeted, chances are they're also having misinformation and a lot of other stuff and lies being told about them. We have to do the work of rehumanizing them to other populations that we need on our side. The third is to reframe. The event has to be interpreted as an injustice. This was not necessary to restore order. The damage was very significant. And here's why we know. This is not just a case of one person who got radicalized. No one gets radicalized by themselves. They are always radicalized by others. Others enabled this to happen. We need to think of those not just who did the thing, but who incited and enabled and allowed the thing to happen. And then the fourth step, redirect. This fourth step, remember, this is the step where authoritarians are going to try to put things into an investigatory process or a judicial process and stretch it out and tightly control it. Now, if you're trying to create Backfire, you could just say, I'm not going to participate in any of that. But that can also sometimes make you look like you're not interested in actually getting to a quote unquote resolution or the truth. So the key thing is whether you participate or not, to continue to keep the issue alive in the public by mobilizing people. Whether it's litigated in a court of law is one thing, but you keep it in the court of a public opinion. And you actually use the institutional process, the institutional channel, as a mobilizing opportunity. If the institutional process is not being carried out fairly, you mobilize around that. If it's revealing facts that are outrageous, we mobilize around that. We don't rely on the institutional process alone to deliver justice. And then the last thing is, of course, people have to be ready to resist intimidation and bribes. And I'll say a little bit more about each of these, but there are the 5 R's. And there's some nice, if you go to endpoliticalviolence.org, you can find on their website some nice, handouts and sheets and synopsis, as well as the larger guide if you want. And so we'll talk about revealing for a second in a little more depth. When you reveal, there's some challenges. Number one, some forms of abuse are not widely reported. For example, threats of political violence, many are unreported. So it's hard to reveal them if you can't find them or validate them. So sometimes you have to look. The targeted person or group has to agree that they want you to actually reveal it. Sometimes they don't. Documentation always helps to prove that an abuse has happened when you reveal it. And then this one is really key. As authoritarians have gotten more brazen around the world, more and more it's like they're raising their hand saying, look at the terrible thing that I did. They're doing less cover-up. There are still some areas where they definitely do try to cover up. But they're doing more now, just overtly, I'm going to do a terrible thing, and it's going to be on social media, and you're going to see it. And that is an effort from them to spread a lot of fear. And if fear exceeds outrage and mobilization, that's a net win for them. They know it's going to outrage people, but if it actually leads, that outrage results in a feeling of hopelessness and despair and confusion and demobilization, they'll take that. That's a good outcome for them. So when we reveal, we can't just reveal the bad thing that happened. The resistance has to be part of the reveal. The bad thing happened and we are standing up and doing something about it. So we reveal in a way that shows that we are not going to accept it. We reveal in a way that shows who the we are, who's us, maybe community members of diverse backgrounds all coming together. And we reveal that we're going to take action. We're actually revealing ourselves as part of that. So that someone might say, my gosh, that terrible thing happened. Wow, that's scary. And look at these courageous people, and my gosh, they're taking action, and that means I might be able to as well. Sometimes you got to move fast to do that. Because when the abuse happens, that's when, if it's already out there, that's when people are reacting to it. If that's creating a net level of fear and demobilization, you got to get out there quickly and be able to be like, we are stepping up. And that's one reason I'm talking about this, because this framework, the 5 R's, is very easy to train people in and very easy to get groups aligned on. And when a group has basic training on it, they can move much, much faster. All right. So then, and by the way, when you reveal, again, think not just of words, but visuals. What's the actual visual of who's talking and who's standing with them? Think of all the aspects of how you're going to reveal, not just what happened, but what your response is. Okay. Second, countering devaluation. So you think, who do we need to get on our side? What are there organizations that we want their attention? Are there communities and audiences that we want to get their attention? What are their values? What do they care about? How do we actually bridge to them? We can characterize the person and what they stood for and who they are, and their humanity and their life in many ways. What are the ways that are going to bridge and get others off the sidelines? Sometimes, to redeem, you use surrogates. You have respected community members speak on their behalf, or people from widely respected professions stand up too. You know you're going to be hit with misinformation and attacks. And often those misinformation and attacks are going to play on, where they can, historical attitudes of racism, sexism, xenophobia, or other forms of prejudice. You can anticipate those, so you already can start thinking, well, we know that's going to come. How do we push back? And sometimes authoritarians will also try to provoke someone they victimize to say or do something that then actually the authoritarian will try to use the backfire framework against the person they've targeted. So they will do authoritarian abuse, try to provoke the target to do something, and then actually try to make it backfire on the target. It's nasty. And then sometimes authoritarian abuse happens to people who we don't normally get along with well, who are not part of who we normally think of as the groups that we organize with. Do we take a stand then? Do we stand for them? Sometimes you're going to be ambivalent about a target, someone who's been targeted, or a group that's been targeted. And that is a question, if you're wanting to do backfire, of how much you actually say, you know what, on principle, we're standing regardless of whether we agree with this person or not. This is about principle, regardless of agreement. That can give you a lot of legitimacy. On the other hand, it might cause fractures in your group. You don't know. And so that is another sort of thing that groups have to think through as they think about putting this into practice. So the third element, reframing. So again, one of the key ways that authoritarians try to reinterpret things is to say, actually, there was no damage done. So evidence is really important sometimes. It's one of the most frustrating things about threats of political violence. They don't leave a physical scar, but we know they affect people's willingness to run for public office, stay in public office, serve in other roles. They affect people's willingness to exercise their rights, to speak up. They affect people's mental health and physical health. They affect people's job performance. They affect people's family lives. They sometimes create financial burdens on a particular official who might have to invest more in security. They have all those effects, and they scare communities. And none of them, very few of those effects I just mentioned, are going to lead to a picture that will be compelling to people. So it is a challenge to say, no, this hurt not just this individual, it hurt the community. Or budget cuts is another example. How do you show that that hurt? Especially when the other side is desperately trying to use their 5-part framework to make sure no one really thinks about this issue. Maybe we have to mobilize in order to dramatize the damage that's been done, to show people that we care. Maybe we need to come up with ways to make it more real to people, to see the harm that has been caused. And one thing we know in this information environment is that what drives narratives is action and courage, more than just words usually. We can talk about an individual or group that's been victimized, but also the broader community that has been affected, because the community is always a target as well. We have to build narratives about who the perpetrators are. Again, are we just focused on quite a few bad apples? Or are we focused on a system or a set of insiders who are very deliberately doing things that are harmful? How do we define who the perpetrator is? And I don't have an answer. It's going to depend on your situation and your group. You'd think about different audiences you want to reach. And then as part of reframing, you have to have a goal, a demand. What are we asking for? This is the real harm that was done. This is who was harmed. These are the effects. And this is who did it. We can be very specific in naming the perpetrators. This is the perpetrator and the insiders of that perpetrator. This is who did it. And here's what we want. You've got to be able to finish the sentence. This is what we're demanding. This is what we need. And of course, there's going to be disinformation used against you. You anticipate that. You think ahead of time. Well, what are they going to say when we say this? And you start to think about how you're going to respond. And the last thing is that as you think about what this narrative reframe you're going to do, you've got to be careful that your narrative reframe doesn't backfire against you. Because authoritarians, they don't just understand how to try to inhibit outrage, they also actually understand the 5-part framework I'm telling you. They will try to make what you do backfire on you. And so if you develop, like, if when you're giving your message, you're so angry, perhaps justifiably, but still so angry, or adopt language that's dehumanizing to the other side and vengeful to the other side, not just an individual who perpetrated, but a broader community, I can say with absolute certainty that what you say will be used as an attempt to switch the subject to now calling you a threat, and that the other side who perpetrated the abuse will actually try to mobilize their base around that. If they can say, whoa, look, they're so threatening, they're so angry, now they're attacking all of us rhetorically, they will actually try to mobilize their base to counter you. And so thinking very carefully through, like, emotion is important. Expressing anger is fine and very appropriate. But there is a discipline to being able to do this in a way where you are able to get a big portion of the public on your side without creating those who are really in the authoritarian camp, without giving them an opportunity to mobilize or call themselves victims or call themselves threatened. So you try to get a big wedge of society to move, and then you isolate the other side. You don't try to energize them. A few other points. Redirect. This is one of my favorite ones because there's 100 different ways you can redirect. So number one, think about any institutional process as a public campaigning opportunity. If there's a trial, maybe there's a running public commentary of the trial. Maybe there's proactive rallies and shows of support for the people who are testifying, who are showing courage in the trial and speaking up. And you can do all kinds of things. You can do all kinds of mobilization. You can meet with people who have been victimized to provide psychological support if they're willing, sometimes economic support, pro bono support, legal support. Some victims will not want to speak publicly, but they will want you to advocate on their behalf, for example, to legislators or law enforcement agencies. If a judge is threatened, for example, they may not want to say, a certain law really needs to be passed to help prevent this from happening. Maybe we need more security, budget at the courthouse, but they might be very interested in you saying that. You can use it as an opportunity to hold trainings, including trainings on training more people on Backfire. You can raise funds as a way to redirect. You can say, look, if you threaten this political candidate, we've got pledges ready to go. Like, more people are going to donate to this candidate. We're going to get more volunteers when you threaten this candidate, for example. Or we're going to register more voters or get out the vote. Or we're going to recruit new candidates. We're going to demand pledges from public officials saying that they denounce the authoritarian abuse that's happened. We can do things to try to counter disinformation campaigns. We can find who's putting out disinformation and show up in person, not just online, and ask them, why are you doing this? And calling them out. We can engage in community mobilization. We can engage in economic pressure. If we're focusing on inciters online, we can look at their advertising or get large numbers of people online to start displaying symbols of opposition to what's going on. There's lots and lots of ways we can think about redirecting when emotions are high and people want to do something. And then the last thing is how do you resist the threats and intimidation? So the first is to understand that solidarity is very important. Making repression backfire is a team effort. And usually what an authoritarian will try to do is find one member of a team or coalition and go after them. Maybe that member or team said something on social media 10 years ago and the authoritarian wants to attack that. Maybe they'll make up a lie about them, whatever. They will try to fracture. And it's really critical, if you're going to confront and go at an authoritarian and try to make the repression backfire, to make sure that your group recognizes we are in this together. We are showing solidarity. If any one of us is attacked, we are going to continue to stick together. We're not going to be fractured. And the second thing, of course, is that in all your public mobilization to remain nonviolent. to understand what the game is, to understand how the authoritarian is going to try to portray you as a threat or something else, and to not play into that. Because when you are able to show power and force and mobilization and get a lot of folks on your side and not be nonviolent, there's nothing that scares an authoritarian more than that. You're winning when you do that. In fact, if they start threatening, you can try to turn those threats into new opportunities for backfire. But it also helps to think through sometimes from a security perspective and from a legal perspective to make sure that you've got your bases covered. You don't want to get exposed to a defamation lawsuit, for example. So you do want to make sure what we say is all going to be within the bounds of what we can say that keeps our certain kinds of risks low. So those are the 5. And I know time is tight, but I will just sort of close with a couple examples of backfire, a few. We've seen examples of backfire in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota. Although the authoritarian abuse that's happened in Minnesota hasn't stopped, we did see signs that when the community stood up and refused to back down and showed solidarity, that there was, hold up 1 second, that there was a considerable level of, hold up 1 second, of backfire. That authoritarian abuse was costly. This is a video of a GOP candidate actually dropping out of the race for governor, saying he doesn't support the way ICE has been doing their mission in the Twin Cities and feels that actually he can no longer even win a race in Minnesota as a Republican because of what's happened. We saw Kristi Noem start to blame others for her performance. We saw the Senate start to call for investigations or resignation of Noem. We saw ICE pull out of Maine suddenly, where they had gone in just a few weeks earlier. You start to see that when people stand up and mobilize, that authoritarians actually, they don't have the capacity to keep going after a while. They start pulling back a bit. And of course, they're not going to declare your victories for you. They're going to try to make it seem like they're not backing down, but you do start to see signs that they're backing down. And you also see signs that more people are mobilizing. So this is a post from Leah Greenberg of Indivisible. After Alex Preddy was killed, saying we're actually going to hold a training now for others to do ICE Watch, to do the same job that Preddy was doing, and 87,000 people signed up. That's backfire. That's saying when you attack, we're not going to get as scared. We're actually going to mobilize more. We saw backfire with the Disney boycott when Jimmy Kimmel was suspended. And what was interesting there to me is that the issue, and when we think about the 5 steps of backfire, the redeem part didn't focus a lot on Jimmy Kimmel as a person. It focused on the First Amendment. The redeeming of that was not about like, let's elevate Jimmy Kimmel. It was like, let's elevate the fact that this is an attack on the First Amendment. Let's elevate the fact that we don't want to live in a country where the president just gets to decide who says what, and then have the FCC threaten whoever they don't like. And so you saw consumers start to boycott Disney and Hulu and their subsidiaries. You saw unions like the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild of America start to push back with strong statements. You saw the ACLU get over 400 individuals in entertainment and creative industries push back. You start to see talent saying, we're not going to work with Disney. You start to see influencers start to push back on Disney, and you even started to see the former CEO start to push back on Disney. That's backfire. And in a short period of time, you saw a significant number of unsubscribes from Disney. And actually this number of 1.7 million was on October 2nd. My understanding is that the number of unsubscribes continue to rise throughout the month of October. But even if you say they got 1.7 million unsubscribes in October alone, if you do the math and say, well, a subscriber maybe pays $15 a month times 12 months a year, that's $180 a year. Well, you multiply that by 1.7 million, and that's like $300 million in losses as an estimate. So that's Backfire. That is incredibly powerful. And what we saw, of course, is that Disney shifted its position, and so did Nexstar and Sinclair. We saw Backfire against Avelo Airlines doing deportation flights in a contract that was estimated at $150 million. People could have just said, well, let's investigate, but instead people mobilized. They called for boycotts. They put pressure on their state legislators to repeal fuel subsidies to Avelo, which actually happened in Connecticut. State legislators even acted and repealed the fuel subsidies, or chose not to renew them in the new legislative session. And you saw pressure on universities and city councils and others to say they won't fly Avelo. You saw Backfire with Tesla Takedown. And I'm going to show one other example, and then I'll go to questions. Discussion. This is a brief Backfire example from the town of Wunsiedel in Germany, where neo-Nazis were marching every year because I guess a Nazi official named Rudolf Hess was buried there. And the neo-Nazis would show up and the town didn't like it, and they'd protest, and it didn't solve the problem. The Nazis kept coming back. So the city council voted to exhume Hess's grave and move it out of town, hoping the Nazis would stop. But the Nazis would still come back to Wunsiedel and march every year. So the town then did this, and I'll play this short video for you.
Wunsiedel in Upper Franconia, a small town with a big problem, a Nazi problem. Because for over 25 years, each year, hundreds of right-wing extremists have been coming here to march through Wunsiedel. The town feels helpless. That's why everything's a little different in 2014, because we've secretly turned this Nazi march into something sensible, Germany's most involuntary walkathon. The idea that every meter the neo-Nazis march, 10 euros go to an exit program aimed at undermining precisely these neo-Nazis. Exit Deutschland. The further they march, the more money is collected. In other words, with every step they take, the neo-Nazis campaign against neo-Nazis and unwittingly finance more and more defections from the extremist scene. And the best thing is, they only find out when they're already marching. At 1:48 p.m. on the dot, the Nazis Against Nazis campaign officially gets underway. For the first time in history, neo-Nazis are marching against themselves. In keeping with the walkathon, motivational posters and banners encourage the participants to keep going and make sure they don't forget what they're marching for, or rather, against. Markings on the road let the stony-faced participants keep track of how much money they've collected. And thought has been given to the right-wing radicals' fitness too. Bananas are being handed out as sustenance, so that even the most unfit neo-fascists will manage to goose-step their way across the finish line in this donation run. At 3:28 p.m, the neo-fascists have reached their goal. 10,000 euros for the neo-Nazi opt-out initiative, Exit Deutschland. 10,000 euros to help right-wing extremists safely defect from the right-wing extremist scene, personally collected by right-wing extremists. Thank you to all the helpers and sponsors. Thank you to the neo-Nazis for collecting donations. Thank you for the miracle of Wunsiedel. Wunsiedel in Upper Franconia, a small town with a big idea.
So that action, after it was done, started to get copied in other towns in Germany, and then started to get copied in Sweden too. And one thing about Backfire campaigns I know is that people love them and they tend to continue to spread. And so in closing, I'll just share that there's a very simple way you can take the Backfire framework and work with folks in your community. It doesn't require a ton of training. You can work with folks in 2 hours, provide an overview of the 5 steps, which are not, even though they come out of academic research, they're not excessively academic. They're all pretty clear. And if you want to learn more, you can go to endpoliticalviolence.org and check it out and download more resources and get comfortable talking about them. And then meet with groups in your community who want that training, and you can train them in a half an hour or the first 45 minutes. And then for the rest of the session, you could say, so think about something that you're worried about, some form of authoritarian abuse that you're worried about, whether it's physical or whether it's a funding cut or some administrative thing, or even just reputational and misinformation. Maybe it's happened before, or maybe you expect it to happen, or you think it might happen. And then do some scenario planning. Think about the 5 steps the perpetrators will do to try to reduce outrage, and then think of the 5 steps you can take to try to make it backfire and mobilize folks. And that kind of just simple, you could even do it an hour and a half, 2 hours, is a really helpful way to orient folks and start to have them see that, wow, we can actually take power. We can understand and make sense of what's going on here, and we can begin to organize. We don't need to wait for someone else to tell us. We can actually start doing that proactively, which is really, really important. So thank you very much, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Hardy. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. So if anyone wants to unmute and or raise your hand and ask a question or leave a question in the chat, we'll take a couple of those.
At the end of your last presentation, you had said that with backsliding democracy, that something else has to be offered. Like the goal is not just to end the authoritarian, but to do something better with the democracy, right? And I'm seeing more and more things that could be improved and hopefully could be built on happening by our protests now, like ending the corruption that's very visible, ending Congress's, well, they're trying to, there are people trying to make the president have more power, you know. So as we protest, should we be thinking about what is that thing that we want to offer to make better?
Mm-hmm.
And who would do that? And how would we do that?
Mm. Yeah, I think I would say a few things on that. The first is that we want to make sure that whatever we are offering, it starts by speaking to people with whatever feels most important to them. So if the grievance that people have is that our town has been neglected for too long, or the grievance that is had is that, my Medicare or Medicaid is being cut or too expensive, or that the costs of things are too high, that is often where we want to start, by something that's tangible and real to them. And so, depending on how much if we don't know the answer to that question off the top of our head, like what are the top 2 or 3 issues that are most likely to get mobilization in our community, we're going to want to do the listening to make sure that we have a sense. And I think that's just a good question in general in our communities. What are the top 2 or 3 issues that are at the top of people's minds in terms of what they think about or worry about? And then the next thing is we're going to want to find a way to bridge, sort of be able to tell a story of how the thing that is of most concern to them relates to a deeper structural issue. So again, I think, the general would be like sort of the messaging progression I think I gave before was, you lost your job because our leaders sold you out. Our leaders sold you out because the system lets them sell you out. So we need to get you your job back, but we also need to fix the system that made you lose your job to begin with. And so some version where we start there, talk about how, yeah, there was a betrayal at the level of a politician, but there was also a system that made that betrayal way too easy. And that's why we've got to deal with both the immediate issue and the underlying reason why that issue exists in the first place. And I think there are some really clear through lines for a lot of grievances, and money in politics, of course, is one of them, that our system seems to increasingly listen more to those who donate to politicians in large amounts than to the rest of us. And so that's, I feel like, a very resonant place to land with folks. But then what do we do about it? Whether it's a question of needing to reform the Supreme Court, and there are a number of different options there, whether particular legislative fixes, that's also sort of a piece of technical research that you're going to want to do. Because there might be things you could do at the state level, or maybe you decide, no, we really need to argue that actually we can't get the kind of change we need until the Supreme Court stops being co-opted by, being sort of functionally a force that is serving authoritarianism and the wealthy in this country increasingly at the expense of the rest of us. And so you've got to figure out sort of where you want to go with that. And that's just, the Supreme Court's just one. I mean, we could focus on gerrymandering. We could focus on lots of different things. But I hope that is at least a little bit helpful. I think there is a need for us to probably not lead, with speeches about how the system, about like specific system reforms, because what we know is that if you talk mostly about that first, people may not be as receptive, but that you start to talk more about it so that people understand and it starts to be familiar to them. Right, there are some key things that we need to change in our political system in the long term. It's not going to be just enough to pass economic policy. We're going to need some changes in the way we do government as well.
Thank you.
Well, we are just about at time, so as we come to a close, I just want to offer thanks to Hardy for grounding us in this research and real-world practice. I think it helps to remember that authoritarianism thrives on fear, fragmentation, and fatalism, but we know that acting strategically and nonviolently will reveal, reframe, redirect, redeem, and resist to make injustice backfire. And I want to encourage everyone to visit endpoliticalviolence.org and do some of the scenario planning in your own context. Please go ahead and mark your calendars for our next and final session in this series, which will take place next Friday, March 27th, and is titled Countering Authoritarian Election Manipulation, which will be a critical topic to cover as we approach this year's midterm elections. Thank you all for being part of this learning community, and we look forward to continuing this journey next week. Have a great Friday, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.